arranged it.
Yeah,
No, it
he's
was
quite a
written
guy.
by Fitch, when Hoover arranged it.
How about 181?
What number?
181. Oh, my bad.
to provide a little bit of context, though, if you look at chapter 17, which we're not going to take a lot of time to do, but Jesus is giving a sermon, and he's talking about being ready for the kingdom. He's talking about the days of Noah. He's talking about the days of Lot, and he's saying these people weren't ready. They weren't ready. They were surprised. They were shocked. They got swept away. Things didn't go well. It was sudden destruction. And then he goes into 18, and it starts by saying in verse 1, then he spoke a parable to them. Now, we don't always catch that, but this is part of the same sermon. So you can assume that if he's telling people that they were swept away, they were surprised, they were destroyed, he's going to tell them now how they can avoid having that happen to them. So, he tells a story. We're going to go to chapter 18. Let's go to verse 2. We'll come back to verse 1, but let's start with verse 2. It says, there was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God nor regard man. Now, what's a judge supposed to do? It's good if he fears God, he regards man, and he follows the law, right? Well, in this case, it would be the laws of God are the ones that he's probably supposed to be following. And at least if he was of Jewish origin, there's some question about that. Sometimes they did have appointed magistrates that might not have even known who God was. But if he was a Jewish elder, which a lot of times when they had problems, they would try to go to the Jewish elders to have problems solved. And if that was the case, then he would have been a Jewish elder that probably should have feared God and had regard for man. But we don't know. It doesn't actually say. So as we go into this, either way, what we know is that he was corrupt. And the judges in those days actually had kind of a problem with that. In fact, these judges, it was kind of a figure of speech from their day, but they said that the judges of their day would pervert justice for a dish of meat. In fact, there was a pun on their title that from their original language kind of sounds funny. Officially, the judges were called Dana Gezeroth, and that means prohibitions or punishments, the ones who would come up with punishment. But people made fun of them by calling them Dana Gezeloth, which means robber. And so they would refer to them as robber judges, and that they would pervert a situation for a dish of meat. Well, in this case, we're talking about a woman who was needing justice. And there was a problem already from the outset because, of course, as you know, women had very few rights in that day and time. If a woman had a husband, then he could go to bat for her. And same if she had a grown son, then he could get some justice for her, possibly. If she was wealthy, then maybe her money could speak for her and she could bribe her way. But if she didn't have any of those things, then she was in a bit of a tight spot. We don't know exactly what the problem was that she was suffering from, but you will recall, since Jesus is telling this story, that one of the most severe accusations that he made against the scribes and Pharisees was made just 2 chapters later in Luke chapter 20, 46 and 47, where he said, beware of the scribes who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation. So it's kind of a leap to assume that it's about the same thing. It may not be, but if it's something that Jesus was talking about in that day of time, it could be that someone was trying to take her house and throw her out on the streets. In any case, she has 2 things on her side. She has the truth, and she has persistence. If we look at verse 3, it says, and there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, grant me justice against my adversary. Avenge me of my adversary. And sometimes that can also just be translated to say, give me justice. The picture being painted here is that she's talking to him over and over again. You kind of get the picture from the tense that they use in the Greek, that he leaves his house and she's waiting outside. Grant me justice. Avenge my adversary. He's walking down the street. He goes to the market. She comes out from behind the market. Give me justice. She won't leave him alone. Especially when he goes to work. She's probably bugging him there. Verse 4 says, and he would not for a while, chronos, for a time, undefined amount of time, but after this time the judge said within himself, though I fear not God, nor regard man, Yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. Or it can also be taken, lest her continual coming she subdue me, is another way that could be put. Likely what he's talking about here, there's a couple of different ways. Maybe he would just get really sick and tired of it and decide he didn't want her following around anymore. But what's more likely for a judge in that day and time is, of course, all of the dealings that took place were by the city gate. There were a lot of people coming and going, a lot of people around. And if this lady was after him all the time, trying to get justice, probably everybody there was getting sick of it. Everybody is saying, what's the problem here? And if pretty soon they're going to look at that judge and be like, what is your problem? What do you need to do for this
Mine
lady?
says, but this woman is driving me crazy. I'm going to see that she gets justice because she is wearing me out
She's
with her
wearing-
constant requests.
I love it. She's wearing me out. So this judge, he doesn't want to get in trouble himself either, right? And sure, he's probably going nuts, and she just won't leave him alone. So then we get the punchline in verses 6 to 8. Then Jesus said, hear what the unjust judge said. Verse 7. And shall God not avenge his own elect who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily.
Amen.
So he's drawing a contrast, isn't he? Jesus wants them to know that he is everything that this judge isn't, and this judge is nothing that God is. The unjust judge doesn't care about her. But God says in Jeremiah 31:3, I have loved you with an everlasting love. The unjust judge doesn't care if she's destitute and burdened. But God says in Matthew 11, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. What Jesus is saying here is what you will get from heaven is very different than what you'll get from this earth. Jesus loves to hear from his people. And we can see that in verse 7 where it said his own elect who cry out to him day and night. Who are his elect? It's the people who have chosen him, right? The elect, those that turn to him for justice, those who turn to him when they're frustrated, those that turn to him when they have needs, when they're treated unfairly, when they're hurting, those who will let Jesus get vengeance for them. He's saying, cry out to me day and night. Like Jeremiah 29:12 says, then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. He wants to listen to us when something good happens or something bad happens, or we're afraid or angry or discouraged or tempted or whatever it is, whether it's our best day on earth or our worst day on earth. He does not get tired. God wants to hear from us all the time. It's kind of like my kids. What's
Wants
that?
to be as persistent as the widow, right?
Exactly. He wants us to keep at it. Don't give up, even when it looks like things aren't right. It's like my kids. When they come to me, I want to hear from them, right? Like my older ones, when they have something to say, I want to hear what they have to say. And one of my little ones, when David comes toddling up to me, I want to stop what I'm doing and hear whatever it is that he has to show me. It's important.
Do you want them to be persistent? Or?
I want them to be persistent. That's right. God isn't worried about being weary of our prayers. I think that he worries more that we'll become weary of praying to him. And so that's the verse 1 that we skipped, where it says, he spoke a parable to them that men ought always to pray and not faint. Keep praying to God as fervently as you did the first time. Just keep praying. Don't give up. Even though it seems like things might be getting worse and worse, don't give up. Even if the world says it's impossible, or your family says it's impossible, or the church says it's impossible, or worst of all, our own minds. Our own minds are sometimes our worst enemy, where we can convince ourselves that things are impossible. Don't ever let that happen. He says, keep praying. Verse 8, I tell you, he will promptly carry out justice on their behalf. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? He's keeping the picture of being a judge here. He's saying he can take care of things. He's saying that sometimes justice seems slow to us. Sometimes the answers seem like they're slow in coming, but in God's time, they will come. We need to keep our eyes on the circumstances not keep our eyes on the circumstances, but instead keep our eyes on God.
Amen.
Amen.
And always remember that the answer will come when the time is right. And then I have a quick story as we get ready to close with that. I don't know if any of you have heard of Tom Popena. Have you ever? He's a really interesting guy. He gives a testimony that he spent years in the mafia. And then through an astounding set of miracles, if you ever get a chance to hear his testimony, it's pretty cool. He goes around and gives it. He turned his life around. He turned to the Lord. And instead of worrying about money and power and all the things that he had worried about, obeying the mob boss, instead, he wanted to work for God. Immediately there was a contract on his head to kill him, and he ran into some fellows later that told him that they had tried to kill him, and every time they had tried, they had failed, and they wanted to know why. He was able to witness, and he was ministering. And all of a sudden, years after he had given up on the mafia and instead was following Christ, he was arrested. And he was surprised. Maybe he shouldn't have been, but he was. But he was being charged with 2 murders, racketeering, and a host of other things, and he couldn't understand it. He said he'd been to jail before. He'd always taken his rap. He'd stayed in jail for everything that he had been given jail time for. But this time, the charges were false. He knew that he had a bad reputation. He figured that's why they had arrested him. So he was hoping that in a day or two they'd figure out they had the wrong guy and let him go. But a day or two became a week, and then a month, and then more months. And they wouldn't even let him out on bail because they said that he was too dangerous. As time went on, he became discouraged, and he started becoming kind of frustrated with God. What was he doing in jail after he had turned his life over to the Lord? His atheist attorney indicated to Tom that with the charges that were being brought against him, he could end up in prison for up to 400 years. But he said, don't worry about it. I'm sure I can get him down to 140 years. Tom cried out to God. He said, that doesn't help. This is a death sentence. I'm going to die in this jail. I could have stayed in the mafia and not ended up any worse than this. I'm going to die here. And it didn't seem fair. He thought that God would protect him, but it felt like God wasn't even listening. He said it felt like his prayers were bouncing off the ceiling. Well, not long before he went to trial, his pastor came and visited him, tried to encourage him, and he said, Tom, tell me something. How do you want me to pray? I'm going to take your request to the church. What do you want us to actually pray for you? Tom answered, for everything that I've done, if they come up with something that I've done that I haven't paid the price for, I'm willing to stay in jail, no problem. But pray that they won't be able to lie against me. That's all I want. Just pray that they can't lie. Well, the trial began. There were people lining up to witness against him. Some of them he recognized, but many of them he didn't even remember ever seeing before. Over and over again, they testified of crimes they had seen him commit. 2 of them testified they saw him kill 2 men in Florida. He hadn't even been in Florida at the time. He had been in New York. And he began to lose his faith in God. He had prayed and asked his pastor in the church to pray that the witnesses would not be permitted to lie, but lie after lie was being told. His pastor came to visit again. Tom told the pastor, if I go to prison for the rest of my life for all of these lies that have been told against me, I don't know if I can ever trust God again. His pastor surprised him when he responded, listen, Tom, I know it looks bad, but the trial isn't over yet. Don't give up your faith. Keep praying. Keep holding on to Jesus. Don't look at the circumstance. Look at God, and don't give up. Keep praying. Well, the trial went on, and it was just as disheartening as it had been from the beginning. But finally, there was only one more witness, and then Tom's case would go to the jury. In the courtroom, they made a big deal of this final star witness. This was the man who had been selected to give his testimony before the grand jury when Tom was indicted. Did I say it right this time? Indicted. I've told the story before and I pronounced that word wrong. Anyway, they said, this is the man who once he gives his testimony, the jury is going to find Tom guilty beyond any shadow of a doubt. and he got up and started to testify. But something wasn't going right. And after a few minutes, to everybody's surprise, the prosecutor himself, turning to the witness, said, "Stop. This is not the story you told the grand jury a few weeks ago, or months ago, actually. Why are you telling a different story here today?" And the man's next words caused quite a stir. He said, "The reason I'm telling the story I am is because when I told the story the first time, you paid me $1,000 to tell that lie, but today you wouldn't even pay for my bus ticket. So I didn't have the same story to tell." Everything stopped. The trial was put on hold while each of the witnesses was carefully checked out. When they were through, it was discovered that many of those witnesses were prisoners themselves. And across the span of witnesses, a total of almost 400 years of jail time had been promised to be wiped off their record if Tom was convicted. One man was serving 100 years in Florida for murder, and he was promised to be out by Christmas if Tom was found guilty. For those that were not in jail, money had been promised to pay them for their testimony if he was found guilty. When the trial resumed, there were 5 people that were still found guilty, but Tom was not. He was cleared of all charges. He realized that God's ways are so much better than our ways.
Amen.
It was really to his advantage for all those lies to be told and then ruined by the last witness so they would be shown for who they really were. Take your eyes off the circumstances. Keep your eyes on God. Never give up. Keep praying. God promises that he loves us unconditionally. He promises that he'll give us everything that we need. We live in a broken world full of hurting people, but God is our only salvation, and he loves us no matter what. So keep praying. Keep your faith. Allow God to do the work he desires in his time in your life. And then a quote that I got from a good friend today. Face the day with the influence of our Heavenly Father. Quiet moments with your heart attuned to him alone. Meet him alone. Meet him regularly. And meet him openly. Let your Heavenly Father be your guide for everything you do. Don't give up. Keep praying. Colossians 4:2 says, devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful.
Amen.
So, like I said, it's kind of on the same topic as this morning.
I think it's pretty awesome.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
But,
God's word is good over and over and over again.
Can I make a comment?
yes.
It just came to me after you did that, of what we found out when we went to California. We had this notion in our mind of what was going to happen, just like this guy had a notion in his head what is going to happen. God's ways are not our ways, and we need to remember that about what happened in California. God's ways, not our ways. He has a way. He's working this out, and thank you for that. because
He's got it figured out.
He's got it figured out, and I don't. And I praise you for that. Thank you for bringing that to mind.
That's awesome. Yeah. Would you close us with prayer, Elder? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Again, our Father in heaven, we pause for a moment and give thanks. What a beautiful time together here. We just had this amazing story that the pastor portrayed to us of a man who thought God had deserted him, but he didn't give up, and he was blessed for it. May we, each and every one, remember, no matter what happens, no matter how tough it gets, God is there. He's looking over us. And as we part our ways and go home, just pray that you'll be with everyone, watch over us, and be with us as we go through another week. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Oh, can I have just a minute?
Yes.
We visited with Zach.
Oh,
Okay.
We were down at the Quartzsite